Good morning and welcome. This is Cheche, the show where opinion counts, live on Citizen TV. I'm your host, Udwak Amimo. The Supreme Court will later this morning deliver its full judgment explaining its decision to annul the August 8th presidential election. As is the pattern in election years, there are concerns about an economic slowdown, and those concerns have grown due to the prolonged electioneering we find ourselves in. And so our focus on Cheche today is on the impact of the extended election season the country finds itself in. Our guests are Dr. Habil Olaka, newly minted PhD in business, so we congratulate you for that. Stephen Mutoro, the Chief Executive of the Consumer Federation of Kenya, COFEC, and Nzetsa Were, a development economist. It's just Mutegi Njau constituting a panel of one because Charles Odhiambo is away this week. So good morning and welcome.
Thank you.
And I'll start with you, Mr. Mutoro, because you speak on behalf, you represent the interests of consumers. So what consequences are you seeing as COFEC as a result of this extended election season?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting season. We've never, first of all, it's unprecedented in this country that we have had to wait for so long to know who our eventual leader is. That anxiety alone, I think, seems to be creating some sort of a lull. And this, both for the product,
a lull in business.
Yeah, a lull in business. And when you talk about business, when you talk about the market, you actually talk about the consumer. Because the consumer is downstream, consumes what is at the market. So whatever factors affect the market, they actually directly affect the consumer. So you're seeing this lull. People are not producing in the market. Then that also affects the law of supply and demand. In the event that we have limited supply, then of course higher demand, people are paying more for limited kind of services. So it's not really a very good scenario. But as we are told, of course, democracy is a very expensive price to pay. So we are holding to see what happens, I think, on October 17th. But in the meantime, we see really a difficult time, a tough time for the consumer, a tough time for the market, because people are withholding even spending, you know. The consumer spending is a factor. You've also seen what's happening in the retail sector. Regardless of the problems that were existing before in the retail sector, you will see that we have seen a scenario where you go to a supermarket and you realize there's nothing. There's nothing. We used to have burger, we used to have all those kind of products. So I think for me the problem is bigger than what we are seeing. Probably maybe in another 2 weeks it could be serious that we have nothing to buy as consumers, and then we have to go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves, where did the rain start beating us in terms of the consumer and the market?
Let me follow up that matter. Because during elections, a lot of money is poured, you know, billions of shillings. Why is it, therefore, we are saying, we talk about less to buy? Where is the money? How is the money spent? It's a lot of money.
Nzetsa?
I think we need to understand that we are having an election in the context of a difficult year. And one of the problems I have with Kenyans is that when it's election year, everything is attributed to the election. Oh, we're in a mess because it's election year. I think we need to understand that this is a tough year for Kenyans anyway. We started the year with a drought, which has led to a lot of inflation. People are finding that their money is not going as far as it used to. So that's one of the factors. The other factor is that we've really seen the interest rate cap come into effect, where lending and the growth of credit has gone down to about 1% now, 1.6%. So the money that people used to get from the banks, either through the bank itself or through the apps on the phone, that money isn't coming forward. So we're having a situation where there's a contraction in liquidity in the market. People are feeling that they're broker than they used to be. And then on top of that, we have an election year where often a lot of important decisions are held back as people wait to see who's going to end up being president. So I think we need to understand that, yes, the election is a factor going on in the economy, but it's not everything. And I think one of the problems that we have is that we have this mindset as Kenyans that, oh, when it's election year, you know, everything is attributed to that. And I think we need to get a bit more sophisticated, look at the structural problems that repeat themselves year after year after year, and be like, well, these are the issues we have as an economy, and these are the factors that the elections are bringing in as well. And
Dr.
that it's
Olaka,
not be all and on.
From where you sit as industry, because we've heard from the consumer perspective, we've heard the analysis from an economist. As industry, what are you seeing? Because we're going into Q3 now, and on the one hand we hear that projections are stable. I think the central bank governor sought to, downplay, sought to reassure us yesterday, but there are concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two aspects to it. The angle that you bring in terms of the sentiments that were coming from central bank, which is indeed true. I mean, is looking at the future given the current blip that we have. And I think looking at the parameters, things are looking promising in the sense that there are quite a number of positive attributes that we can sort of like hinge on to see what the future holds. But having said that, I think the impact of the elections, we cannot discount it. It's being felt. There's a tendency world over for during the elections for the consumer to have, generally the public to have this a wait and see kind of approach. The investors tend to hold back. From the banking sector, you can feel it, even with what Andita said about the fact that the impact of the interest capping coming into effect. But even the little credit that is being approved, we are seeing the borrowers tending to develop this a wait and see attitude. You've got a facility that is already approved, but you're not drawing down on it, waiting to see what happens before you draw down on it.
How much of that, though, is due to what Nzete tells us, that some of it is due to the fact that we were already in a tough year, and how much of it is due to the fact that this is an unprecedented election campaign, season, the likes of which we've never seen?
What tends to happen is that when a decision like this is made, and I think we also need to give it some credit.
Decision, you mean?
A decision as in the decision to annul the election and, have another election done in 60 days. And that tends to prolong that wait and see attitude that was already existing in the market. So you prolong it by another 60 days. What then happens is that the same inactivity is just prolonged because everybody is in this election mood. Economic activity is not picking up. We're not seeing much of activity, happening, and so we do not expect to start picking up until after the election has been held.
And let me just add to what he's saying. If you look at the pattern of election years in Kenya, 7 of the past 10 elections have been associated with an economic slump. So typically in an election year, our GDP contracts by about 1.2 to 1.4%, and it takes about 26 months to recover. So we do have this historical sort of process going on, where in an election year, the GDP takes a hit. And if you look at our Q1 GDP figures released by the government, we're at about 4.7% GDP growth, whereas last year we were at about 5.8%. So this is a historical pattern that we tend to fall into as Kenyans, and I think people are beginning to have this attitude that the gentleman is talking about, where you wait and see and you prepare your business to the extent possible for a quieter time.
Mutegi, you've seen several elections. Do you think that what we're seeing is unusual given the unprecedented nature of this election season?
It is actually very unusual because if you remember, the stock exchange, the stock market collapsed at one Friday for a few hours. And
after the Supreme Court verdict was released.
And then it rose again, and even now, it is still in limbo.
Markets
Can I speak to that?
Yes.
Markets world over tend to react to news, whether positive or negative news. And also they tend to react to, any lack of information. Now, in this particular case, on a Friday, there was the decision that was announced. The markets react, and more often than not, markets tend to overreact. They go, like for example, if negative news, they tend to swing into the extreme direction, and eventually it then
and so the market interpretation of the Supreme Court
decision, yes, we saw it, for example, in the market capitalization of the Nairobi Securities Exchange, where it wiped off quite a bit. The same thing continued on Monday. The following week on Monday, it again wiped off quite a bit. But then subsequently, we start seeing a correction, because there's a tendency to overreact and then correct back to the equilibrium position. So I think, and those are normal reactions of the market. We should not look at it in terms of just a long-term, impact.
It's not long-term, but is it political? Does the market favor one party or candidate over another?
No. Markets tend to just react on how they perceive it to affect the business going forward. So whichever way the decision goes.
Yes, first of all, I would like also to congratulate Dr. Olaka. I mean, for me, the interesting bit is that economists will tell us for being joining the PhD circles. I think that is really, I mean, I don't mean fit for him. But the interesting bit is that economists will tell us a lot of theory. They will tell us a lot of English. You know, when you talk about an election, there's something that's so basic, something so fundamental. You are not in business, Woodwork, if you are not doing business with government. That's the talk. You are not in business if you are not doing business with government. And normally government tends to slowly shut down during that time. Parastatals would not, for example, pay suppliers. Now suppliers will be told to wait until after election or something like that. Now, when you talk about a supplier to the market, you're actually affecting many people along the chain. So in my view, it will be very, I think, not accurate to say that elections can be discounted in terms of affecting the market. Now, if, for example, a supplier has given a product A and has not been paid by company B, and then the company B is employing maybe a number of C people. No, those people are supporting families and somehow cash flow is affected. When you talk about even investment, you know, it's only in Kenya that we talk about markets sometimes almost exclusive of the consumer aspect. Because market exists because of the consumer side. Because if you are talking about a market, for example, Habil was saying that you even have credit, but you're holding back not to invest. Because you ask yourself, if you're going to invest, who's going to buy that product during that time? And for me, a simple example would be, would you take a loan at the moment and invest in some sort of an entertainment business? Are people getting entertained? I mean, those are some more fundamental questions. What kind of business can you actually do successfully during an electioneering period? Muteki talked about people are spending. I would actually talk about impulsive kind of expenditure. The people who are actually doing politics, they're also in business. And that money they were spending in politics, they were actually drawing from businesses and then blowing it out. The assumption was...
Is that your experience because you were a Kenyan?
I wouldn't want to talk about that. I'm here as Secretary General. I'm here as Secretary General of the Consumer Federation of Kenya. But that could be accurate also. Because one thing we are forgetting, everybody had done calculations knowing that you'll spend up to 8th of August. Little do we know that we'll have extra time. We didn't have some sort of saving energy in terms of finance. So I think it's a very interesting scenario that the market actually doesn't have money. And even when it has money, consumers cannot be able to buy. Then there are also very basic things, maybe in conclusion, very basic things like security. Yesterday, for example, we had demonstrations in parts of the country. We were getting reports, I don't know how accurate they are. In parts of Nairobi, for example, people are being probably harassed, you know, commuters are being harassed and that kind of thing. When there are those kind of fears, even consumers will not go out and spend. So for me, I think we need to look at elections more than just the process. I think we need to look at it more as the implication of an election, both qualitative and quantitative on the market and even on consumption.
And that's what we're exploring here. You were speaking a lot of English. You
know, this is the typical thing that they say, and then they speak the English themselves. But I think one of the problems that we're having is that we're having a very one-dimensional analysis of what's going on. I think if you look at the complexity of the Supreme Court decision, it has short-term effects, it has long-term effects, it has positive effects, and it has negative effects. And I think we're trying to say, oh, it's all positive, all negative. So in the short term, it's been largely problematic, as the panelists have been talking about. Businesses slowing down. If you look at Moody's, they actually graded us downwards. We're now credit negative because the business outlook is uncertain. We're not certain of the investment climate. So in the short term, a lot of the immediate hits are being felt by the business and the private sector, and I think everybody acknowledges that. But I think in the long term, one of the bigger narratives that's happening in Kenya is that we're showing that the rule of law is there, that our institutions are robust. So when we're going into the next election, people won't go to the streets, they'll go to the courts, and we're creating a sense of stability and political stability going forward, which augurs well for the economy. So I think we need to understand that the immediate effects that we're feeling now, but in the long term, we are creating a trajectory where perhaps elections won't have as much of an impact as they do. And I think one of the things we need to remember also
is that the case?
No, one of the things we need to remember, can I finish? one of the things we need to remember is that we're a young economy and a young democracy. So the reality is that whatever happens in politics will tend to affect the economy. Whatever happens in the economy, they will speak to each other. So I think this sort of be-all, end-all, this is the effect of, you know, the elections in the long term, I think is a bit simplistic.
Mutegi touched on something earlier, that, you know, around the election campaigns, we see a lot of money flowing. Would you characterize that as economic activity? Why don't we feel the impact of that? Why do we see, you know, T-shirts and money being splurged, but that not translating into our overarching figures on growth?
I think there are a couple of things going. I think the first thing is that we were already in an environment where liquidity was very short and hard to come by.
But we saw liquid politicians.
Yeah, let me finish. So I think even though the money was being poured in, it was in a context where things were quite dry. So I think the impact of that was a bit subdued. I think also the spending in election is changing as devolution really comes to bear, because the people are realizing that you need to spend money in the primaries, so that once you get that position, particularly in areas where they know that the community is going to vote this way or that way, once you spend your money in the primaries, you don't really need to continue spending money to convince people to vote for you, because you're in that area and you know the people will vote for that party anyway. So I think we're seeing a nuanced change, whereas in the past people used to just spend money. And I think what people are beginning to realize is that we need to be a bit more strategic in how we spend our money, because once you secure the seats, perhaps we've been guaranteed. Now, where that is not the case is in swing states, in swing counties, where it's not sure this way or that way. But for the most part of the country, once you've gotten the seat in the primaries, I think the impetus is a bit less pronounced.
Would that make sense to you, Mutegi?
Yes, but I would like to ask Dr. here. You sought audience, or the president sought you. I don't know what happened, but you and a meeting with the president. What was the rationale for the meeting, and did you get anything useful that you can say you got confidence from the meeting?
As KEPSA, I think.
As KEPSA, yes.
Oh, yes. I think the whole thing was just to give an assurance to the market of the fact that nothing is changing. We, as business, have got concerns which need to be addressed by the political establishment, and we have got concerns in terms of the way the economy is beginning to slow down, and we need to have some concerted effort by all the parties to ensure that the economy picks up. But having said that, I think out of the current development, there are some positive things that I see. For example, the ruling itself has more or less strengthened the institutions, showing the kind of maturity that the institutions have,
so
and therefore the long-term stability.
Absolutely,
in terms of the long-term stability of the nation. And having said that, irrespective of how the political establishment evolves going forward, in terms of the strength in numbers and everything, I do not see the currently established framework changing in terms of still being a market-based economy. We might have a little bit of games here and there, but I think in the long-term perspective of the direction in which the economy is going, we're not going to steer away from that market-driven economy. That being the case, therefore, most investors now will be taking a long-term view. And in fact, in some sectors, by the way, like for example, the extractive sectors, we do not see them taking a short-term view in terms of the next 1-2 years, because the investment is long-term, and so they are looking over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And you're not going to make that decision on the basis of what's happening currently, because we do not see this having a long-term impact on the economy. It's something that happens almost like every 5 years, but in terms of the overall direction.
So explain, because Anzeta has told us that, we go through this economic slump periodically every election year, and it takes us about 2 years to recover. And so you're saying that for certain industries, the 2 years, is inconsequential. But for others, it will be. I mean, think about it. We've just talked about the money that was lost on the stock exchange. You've explained to us about the correction. But for a whole week, between the announcement and the petition, the verdict on the petition, you notice that week was particularly slow. There wasn't a lot of economic activity. Roads were clear. People stayed indoors. What does that do for the economy, but also just in terms of people living their daily lives?
I think we need to look at it in terms of the fact that we are putting institutions in place, and we are beginning to show some maturity. if you look at what happened in 2007, 2013, and 2017, there's definitely a marked improvement in terms of this, even the strength of the institutions. Even look at the judiciary, in terms of the decisions they have made and how they come out as a strong institution that can be able to resolve disputes between the disputing parties.
But also push back.
Yes, I mean, that is still trying to show their independence in terms of the fact that they are a constitutional institution that has got to be there to resolve, to play a particular role as per the Constitution. Now, I think we therefore need to look at it in terms of the fact that we are actually slowly maturing, and therefore the negative effects as we move forward will be much more reduced.
I think to add to what he's saying is that one of the things that we, in terms of an investor perspective looking at Kenya, is that this was anticipated, okay, in terms of it's going to be a slow year. What wasn't anticipated was a Supreme Court decision, but I think in terms of investor activity, people had anticipated that this will be a slow year, which is good for Kenya in that we are a bit predictable in that sense, that when it's an election year, things are going to slow down there, so that's expected. When you look at our neighbor Tanzania, where, edicts are being made from the president that is creating a very, an environment of uncertainty. You don't know when policy is going to change. You don't know when regulatory structures are going to change. That is a lot more risky from an investor perspective because they can't anticipate what's going to happen in that economy. Whereas what we're going through here is a bit predictable, even though it is unprecedented. I think people just knew that this year was going to be slow anyway, and we've just extended that uncertainty going forward.
What if there is no election after 60 days?
I think for me it's a very interesting question, take even that. But I think I like talking about basics. We forget, many analysts, I think, forget that our kind of economy has a stronghold, by politics. You look at any sector, you look at the major 5 investors, they have some political kind of inclination. So it's very difficult to divorce the market from politics in terms of even investors. So for me, the interesting bit then is, until politics is done, what happens? And when I talk about stranglehold, the discussion yesterday, it should worry anybody who talks about being in business when you hear none other than the Chief Justice of a country, talk with the kind of fury he spoke yesterday, to the point of saying, guys, if you don't want judiciary, why can't you call a referendum and do away with it altogether? That alone, I think, gives a lot of fear. Look at
why?
Why is because when you have the person in charge of justice looking, for example, more, for lack of a better word, more scared in terms of dispensing his job because of political attacks, then it actually causes a lot of worry. I saw also some section of the media trying to say, for example, the ruling that's going to be delivered today had some sort of what you could call inducement or things like that, the allegations that have been made. So in my view...
So let's clarify that, because what you're telling us really is what we have seen is a campaign against the judiciary. Parts of the Supreme Court have been accused of colluding with some of the political parties, and so therefore there have been aspersions cast on the independence of the Supreme Court and the independence.
Even the
IBC.
And the IBC.
I think the point I wanted to say is that we are talking about, I agree with Dr. Olaka that we're actually maturing institutions. But I think the kind of attacks, the kind of threats that these institutions are having, I think has never been seen before. If you look at different political divides, there's one that seems to be like supporting, for example, the IBC. There's another one, for example, seems to be attacking the IBC. There's another one attacking the judiciary. And then there's another political divide seeming like is sort of supporting. Now, that kind of conflicting attacks, for me, affect the market. And how does it affect the market? I've said, not any single sector, even in the media, by the way, not any single sector does not have the 5 major investors from the political class or people probably linked to the politics. So for me, I'm just saying this, the scenario here is, regardless of what is going on in terms of institutions growing, I think the biggest danger we have is that the new threats that are happening to the institutions I think, call for a bit of worry. Because even if Olaka would say, I'm thinking about an extractive industry, maybe tall oil or something, I'm investing in the next 20 years. I mean, I cannot be naive to want to think about 20 years or 15 years, invest a lot of money in this country, probably when I could have a better business climate in a neighboring country. So some certain decisions must be made that would obviously affect the level of investment. And I think when we talk about institutions and investment and elections, I think we should not forget one thing, that what the leaders are saying, and when I say the leaders, heading the arms of government, the executive, the judiciary, I think they have a better forum. They have a better forum to discuss their frustrations than spilling the public. Because once you say, like the Chief Justice actually at the end of his presentation said, he appealed to Kenyans of goodwill to stand up for the judiciary. And we've also had similar frustrations of the head of executive. We've had also challenges at the legislature. So for me, I think unless we fix or we talk the market, we talk the future of this country and the economy in relation to the leadership of the three arms of government, then uncertainty will continue.
I think another factor informing the uncertainty is that we're not an ideologically led political system. And I think that's a fundamental problem, particularly when you're looking at investors and the possibility of change in rule and rulership. One of the problems that's going on is that we don't know what an opposition government would look like. I mean, we've got the manifestos, which is really just a list of promises of the what, but there's not much of the how. How are you going to change strategy? How are you going to change policy to generate the revenue to meet all these things that you've listed in your manifesto? So I think when you're looking at it from an investor perspective, we have a general sense of how Uhuru and his administration has taken rule, but I think there is more scope for the opposition to give Kenyans and investors a clear sense of this is how we would rule if we were in power, by shadowing. Now people say, oh, we can't shadow because we're not the British parliamentary system. I think that's a very simplistic argument. I think we can learn from that system and apply it to Kenya, where opposition shadows. When there's a budget, can we have a shadow budget? When there's an agricultural policy, can we have a shadow agricultural policy? How would opposition have dealt with the interest rate cap issue? What would the decision have been? I think once we create a narrative of critiquing the strategic intelligence and gives us a sense of how people would rule, then a lot of the anxiety that we have around, oh, we don't know what's going to happen, I think some of that would be mitigated. And I think we as Kenyans also tend to understate how we could create a more stable environment going forward so that we don't have this scenario every 5 years.
Whoever is in opposition following the repeat presidential poll, if it does take place, that's a question we've asked several times of the existing opposition at the moment. Motegi, you'll agree with me. And I don't believe we've ever received any sort of conclusive responses to alternative strategies or shadowing. And so hopefully whoever's in opposition following this election will give us a credible opposition that shadows policies and offers their thinking around that. I think we've got to take a break now. This is Cheche, and we're live on Citizen TV. We'd like to know how this prolonged election season has affected you, your business, your education, your wallet. Talk to us. Our SMS number is 22422, or you can reach us on Twitter using the hashtag Cheche.